What kind of woman leaves her ex-husband $33.5 million after 15 years of silence? I'm Jerry Flores, 65, a retired power plant worker living in a modest Rock Springs apartment, where the biggest drama should have been my neighbor's soggy begonias, not a phone call upending my life. That Tuesday morning, I'm kneeling on the linoleum, sopping up coffee from a shattered mug, while Eleanor Henderson's voice pierces through the window, railing about my sprinklers flooding her flower beds again. The new automatic system's got one loose joint, sending water across the property line every third day, and Eleanor's not one for forgiveness. My hands are sticky with coffee, the air thick with her complaints about property values, when the phone rings. I ignore it, focused on the spreading brown puddle, but it keeps shrilling, cutting through her tirade. By the fifth ring, I toss the soaked towel into the sink and answer. Jerry Flores speaking. The voice on the other end is crisp, professional. Mr. Flores, this is Janet Morrison from Morrison Welsh & Associates in Cheyenne. My stomach tightens. That tone always means trouble. I'm calling regarding Brianna Elizabeth Flores. My grip on the receiver hardens. Nobody's called her that in my presence since our divorce in 2010. What about her? Sir, I'm very sorry to inform you that Mrs. Flores passed away Tuesday evening. The words hit like a fist to the chest. I sink into the kitchen chair, its familiar creak deafening in the sudden quiet. Tuesday evening, 3 days ago, while I was cursing sprinklers and scrubbing stains. Mr. Flores, are you there? Yes, I manage, voice distant. How'd you get my number? Your name was listed in her personal effects as an emergency contact. A pause. I understand you were previously married. 22 years of marriage reduced to a footnote. Yes, divorced in 2010. There will be a reading of the will following the funeral service this Friday at Riverside Memorial Chapel. You're named as a beneficiary, so your presence would be appreciated. Beneficiary? The word feels impossible. Brianna built her empire after we split, turning her small consulting firm into a juggernaut I only glimpsed in headlines. What could she possibly leave me? Outside, Eleanor's still at her begonias, hands on hips, but her voice fades to a distant hum. The chapel on Grand Avenue? I ask, nodding though Janet can't see. Yes, service at 2, reading at 4:30 downtown. I hang up, staring at the phone as if it might ring again with different news. The coffee stains setting into the floor, dark rings I'll have to scrub later, but I can't move. Brianna, vibrant, stubborn Brianna, gone. The afternoon light slants through the window, catching dust motes that dance like memories I've tried to bury. I'm back in 1987, Murphy's Diner, a snowy February night. She's in a red wool coat, tearing into the manager about his sexist hiring. You won't consider women for weekend manager because they can't handle pressure? Her voice carries, sharp and fearless. I'm mid-bite of apple pie, fork frozen, watching her profile, high cheekbones, dark hair catching the light. She's magnificent, sliding a business card across the counter. When you hire based on qualifications, call me. The diner feels smaller when she leaves. I grab her card, Brianna Chin, business consultant, and memorize the number before stepping into the cold. 3 days later, I call. Brianna Chin. This is Jerry Flores from Murphy's. A pause. The guy with the apple pie who defended my honor. I blush. You heard that? I was getting my gloves. You left a good tip too. I hear her smile. So Jerry, what can I do for you? Dinner, somewhere better than Murphy's. She laughs, real and warm. Saturday, Romano's 7. That night, in her red coat and a black dress, we talk for hours. Her California childhood, my power plant job, our love for old movies. When she laughs at my story about flooding my apartment fixing a faucet, I'm falling. 6 months later, I propose in that diner, sliding a ring across the counter. Marry me, Brianna Chin. She says yes before I finish. Our wedding's perfect. September sun, wildflowers, her grandmother's dress. Forever, she whispers. I believed her. Now, sitting in my kitchen, her death feels like a betrayal of that promise, and the will reading looms like a storm I can't predict. The 3 days before the funeral dragged on like a slow-moving river, each hour pulling me deeper into the currents of what we had been. I cleaned my apartment obsessively, pressing my one good suit until the creases could cut glass, all while rehearsing words I'd never say aloud. Brianna's death hung over me, a shadow that made everyday tasks feel trivial, and yet the memories kept flooding back, insistent as the Wyoming wind. Sitting at my kitchen table that first evening, nursing a cold cup of tea, I let my mind wander further into those early days, beyond the proposal, to the moments that cemented us together before life started testing the bonds. Our first date at Romano's wasn't just dinner. It was the beginning of a world I hadn't known I was missing. The restaurant was cozy, with candlelight flickering off red checkered tablecloths and the smell of garlic bread wafting from the kitchen. Brianna arrived right on time, shedding her red coat to reveal that black dress that hugged her figure just enough to make my heart stutter. We ordered pasta and wine, but the food was secondary to the conversation that flowed like we'd known each other for years. She told me about growing up in California, the daughter of immigrants who ran a small grocery store. How she'd fought her way through business school on scholarships and sheer will. I learned early that nothing comes free, she said, her eyes sparkling with that fire I'd seen at the diner. I shared stories from my childhood in Wyoming, the endless skies and the power plant job I'd taken straight out of high school, steady work that kept the lights on for folks in town. We bonded over our love for classic films. Casablanca was her favorite, the romance and sacrifice resonating with her ambitious spirit. When I confessed my failed attempt at fixing that leaky faucet, flooding my apartment up to the ankles, she threw her head back and laughed. A sound so genuine it warmed me from the inside out. That night, walking her to her car, I stole a quick kiss under the street lamp, and she kissed me back with a promise of more. The dates that followed blurred into a whirlwind of discovery. We'd drive out to the countryside on weekends, picnicking near Flaming Gorge, where the water shimmered like a mirror under the sun. One afternoon, as we lay on a blanket watching clouds drift by, Brianna opened up about her dreams. Not just consulting, but building something that could change lives, empower women in business the way she'd been overlooked. The world's full of managers like that one at Murphy's, she said, propping herself on an elbow. I want to prove them wrong. I admired her drive, but I added my own quiet wisdom, telling her about the reliability of steady effort, how the power grid didn't run on flash, but on consistent care. She teased me for being too practical, but I saw the way she listened, absorbing it like soil taking in rain. We explored Rock Springs together. Simple things like browsing used bookstores where she'd pick out management tomes and I'd grab mystery novels, or hiking local trails where the wildflowers reminded her of home. One new memory that stands out now in the haze of grief was a rainy Saturday we spent at my tiny apartment. The storm kept us indoors, so we cooked spaghetti from scratch, sauce splattering everywhere as we laughed over my clumsy chopping. That day, she confessed her fear of failure, how it drove her harder than success ever could. "What if I'm not enough?" she whispered. I pulled her close, assuring her she was more than enough, and we danced in the kitchen to an old radio tune, rain pattering against the windows like applause. By spring, our connection had deepened into something unbreakable. I took her to meet my parents at their ranch outside town, where my mom served homemade pie, and my dad shared stories of the old mining days. Brianna charmed them effortlessly, discussing business trends with Dad while helping Mom in the garden. "She's a keeper," Mom whispered to me later. And she was. 6 months in, back at Murphy's Diner on a whim, I proposed. The ring was simple, a single diamond I'd saved for, sliding it across the counter where her card had once lain. "Marry me, Brianna Chin. Make me the luckiest man in Wyoming." Tears glistened in her eyes as she said yes, and the manager, overhearing, compete our pie with a gruff congratulations. Planning the wedding brought new joys and small challenges. We argued lightly over details, like whether to have a big reception or keep it intimate, but always resolved with kisses and compromise. I remember the night before the ceremony, lying awake in my childhood bed, imagining our future. A home filled with laughter, maybe kids someday, supporting each other's paths. The wedding day dawned bright, September sunshine bathing everything in gold. Brianna walked down the aisle in her grandmother's altered dress, carrying those wildflowers we'd picked at dawn, their scent mixing with the crisp air. My hands shook, slipping the ring on her finger, vows exchanged with voices thick with emotion. "Forever," she whispered during our first dance, and in that moment, surrounded by friends and family under a tent strung with lights, I believed it with every fiber of my being. But as I snapped back to my apartment, the tea long gone cold, I wondered how forever had fractured so completely. The funeral loomed, and with it, the possibility of facing Dustin, our son who'd become a stranger. Those early years had been pure, but even then, hints of change lurked, like Brianna's late nights poring over business plans while I read bedtime stories to myself. I pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the man I'd been then, full of hope, unaware of the storms ahead. Dustin arrived 2 years after the wedding, a squalling red-faced miracle that turned our quiet house into a symphony of cries and coos. I remember standing in the hospital room watching Brianna cradle him with that fierce determination she brought to everything, thinking this was the pinnacle, the moment that made all promises real. But even then, as nurses bustled around and the beeps of monitors filled the air, I noticed her eyes drifting to a business magazine on the nightstand, a subtle pull that hinted at worlds beyond our new family bubble. Those first months were a blur of sleepless nights and joyful discoveries. Dustin's tiny fingers wrapping around mine, his gummy smiles lighting up the room like dawn breaking over the mountains. We'd take turns rocking him in the old wooden chair I'd refinished, singing lullabies off-key until he drifted off, the scent of baby powder mixing with Brianna's perfume in a way that felt like home. Our days settled into a rhythm that balanced work and wonder. I'd head to the power plant at dawn, grease under my nails by midday, while Brianna managed her consulting gigs from home, phone calls squeezed between feedings. Weekends were sacred, family outings to the park, where Dustin would gurgle at squirrels scampering up trees, or lazy afternoons baking cookies, flour dusting the counters as we laughed over lopsided shapes. One memory that surfaces now, sharp as yesterday, was our first family vacation, a road trip to Yellowstone when Dustin was 6 months old. We packed the Honda with diapers and thermoses, driving through winding roads lined with pines, the air crisp with promise. At Old Faithful, as the geyser erupted in a plume of steam, Brianna held Dustin close, whispering about nature's power, but I caught her checking her pager midway, a client query pulling her back. "Just one quick call," she said, stepping away, and though it was minor, it planted a seed of unease, like a cloud edging the horizon. As Dustin grew from infant to toddler, the joys multiplied. His first steps happened in our living room, wobbling toward me with arms outstretched, Brianna capturing it on our clunky camcorder with cheers that echoed off the walls. We'd read him stories at bedtime, alternating nights, me with tales of cowboys and adventures, her with books on inventors and dreamers. "He needs to see possibilities," she'd say, eyes bright. I agreed, but suggested balance, like teaching him to build forts from blankets or fish in the local creek. Those simple moments grounded us. Picnics by the river, where Dustin splashed in shallow water, his laughter mingling with the rush of current. Or holidays spent with extended family, turkey roasting while we played board games around the table. Yet, Brianna's ambition began weaving through like vines overtaking a fence. When Dustin turned 3, she landed her first big contract, consulting for a local firm on efficiency strategies. Suddenly, evenings included her typing reports while I handled bath time, her focus sharpening on growth charts and projections. "This could be the start of something big," she'd say, excitement lighting her face, and I'd nod. Proud but sensing the shift like the family scale tipping ever so slightly. By the time Dustin started preschool, the changes were more pronounced. Brianna's business was expanding, bringing in enough for us to move to a bigger house on Hillcrest Avenue, with 3 bathrooms and a kitchen island that gleamed under pendant lights. "Isn't this wonderful?" she asked one night, gesturing at the new dining room with its crystal chandelier. "We could entertain properly now, host playdates that doubled as networking." Dustin adapted quickly, his toy box overflowing with educational gadgets, puzzles that taught shapes and colors, early reader books stacked high. At 7, she bought him a real computer, not a toy, worth more than my monthly pay. "He needs to understand technology," she explained, watching him click through programs I'd never mastered. "The future's digital. I'd suggest teaching him to fish instead, casting lines into the green river like my dad did with me," but she'd laugh. Not unkindly at first, saying we had to prepare him for the real world. Those weekends fishing became rare treats, just Dustin and me, rods in hand as the sun dipped low, him asking questions about bait and patience that felt like echoes of my own childhood. The housekeeper came twice a week. Our fridge dispensed ice through the door, and Dustin's room resembled a high-tech playground. I missed our old scarred kitchen table, marked by crayon scribbles and late-night talks, but the new one demanded coasters, reflecting every smudge. Entertaining ramped up, business associates over for dinners where conversations swirled around markets and strategies. I'd wear my best shirt, try to chime in, but hedge funds and restructurings left me adrift. Jerry works at the power plant, Brianna would explain, her tone carrying an apologetic edge that stung, like I needed excusing. Dustin thrived in this evolving world, chatting programming with her clients at 10, critiquing wines at 12, restaurants we couldn't have afforded before. Family camping trips drew eye rolls. He preferred Brianna's conferences in Denver, coming back with stories of skyscrapers and deals. "Dad doesn't understand," became his refrain, sighed with sophistication beyond his years. Looking back from my empty apartment, preparing for the funeral, I see how those subtle shifts built like pressure in a fault line. Brianna's eyes, once soft with shared dreams, hardened with calculations. Our bedtime stories gave way to her laptop glow, and Dustin's affections tilted toward her world of shine and speed. I held on to the small victories, teaching him to tie knots or fix a bike chain, but the undercurrent pulled stronger, foreshadowing the rifts that would one day split us wide. The service was tomorrow, and with it, the confrontation I dreaded, but these memories armored me. Reminders of a love that had once been whole. Dustin's transformation from a curious kid splashing in rivers to a polished preteen critiquing wine lists didn't happen overnight, but it felt like it. By the time he was 10, our house on Hillcrest Avenue pulsed with Brianna's success. A monument to her ambition that left me feeling like a guest in my own life. The chandelier gleamed, the fridge hummed with filtered water, and our social calendar filled with dinners for her clients. Mining executives, tech entrepreneurs, people whose worlds revolved around stock options and mergers. I'd stand in my pressed shirt trying to follow their jargon, but my stories about keeping the power grid steady fell flat among talk of market shares. Brianna would introduce me. "Jerry works at the power plant." And I'd hear that apologetic edge in her voice, sharper each time, like my job was a flaw to explain away. At night, lying beside her in our king-size bed, I'd smell the faint citrus of her perfume and wonder when we'd stop talking about anything but schedules and Dustin's future. Dustin soaked up this new world like a sponge. At 12, he'd hold court at these dinners, tossing out terms like algorithm optimization with Brianna's clients, who'd nod approvingly while I marveled at my son becoming someone I barely recognized. He'd roll his eyes when I suggested family outings, camping by the Green River or hiking the trails we used to love. "That's boring, Dad," he'd say, already mimicking Brianna's dismissive tone. Instead, he tagged along to her business conferences, coming home with sleek gadgets and stories of hotel suites in Salt Lake City. I'd try to reconnect, teaching him to fix a loose bike chain or build a fire, but his sighs grew heavier, his patience thinner. "Mom says these connections matter," he'd argue, parroting her lessons about networks and opportunities. I wanted to tell him connections to family mattered more, but the words stuck, drowned out by the hum of our new life. Brianna's firm was no longer a small operation. It was a machine, landing contracts with national companies, its name splashed across trade magazines. She'd work late, her office lights spilling under the door as I read alone in bed, the house silent except for the click of her keyboard. One night, new in my memory, I found her at 2 a.m., papers strewn across the dining table, eyes bloodshot but blazing with focus. "This deal could triple our revenue," she said, barely looking up. I offered coffee, hoping to steal a moment, but she waved me off, lost in spreadsheets. I stood there, holding 2 mugs, feeling the distance widen like a crack in the earth. Our old kitchen table, scarred with Dustin's crayon marks, was long gone, replaced by this polished slab that reflected my face back at me, a stranger in my own home. The entertaining never stopped. A dinner for a Denver-based CEO stands out, where Dustin, barely 13, charmed the room with talk of coding trends, while I fumbled through small talk about weather. Brianna glowed, steering the conversation, but when she mentioned my job, Her tone carried that familiar excuse. "Jerry keeps the lights on for Rock Springs," she said, and the CEO nodded politely, already turning to Dustin. Later, as we cleared plates, I whispered, "Do you have to make it sound like I'm just the help?" She froze, then sighed. "I'm proud of you, Jerry, but this is a different world." That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering when my world had stopped mattering. Dustin's 14th birthday brought a new low. Brianna planned a ski trip to Jackson Hole, just the two of them, leaving me to handle plant maintenance during a snowstorm. I'd suggested a family barbecue instead, something simple with his school friends, but Dustin scoffed. "That's so basic, Dad." When they returned, he showed off a new smartwatch, a gift from one of Brianna's clients, while I handed him a fishing rod I'd carved myself. He barely glanced at it, muttering thanks before diving into his phone. I caught him later, alone by the garage, staring at the rod like it puzzled him. "You okay, buddy?" I asked. He straightened, slipping back into his polished persona. "Yeah, fine." But for a second, I saw the confused boy beneath, and it broke my heart. The rift wasn't just with Dustin. Brianna and I argued more, small things ballooning into battles. One evening, over dishes, I pushed back about her missing Dustin's science fair for a client meeting. "You're never here anymore," I said, soap suds dripping onto the floor. Her eyes flashed, cold and calculating. "Someone has to fund this life, Jerry? You think power plant pay covers this house?" I wanted to scream that I'd trade the house for our old life, for late-night talks and shared dreams, but her phone buzzed, and she was gone, answering another crisis. Outside my apartment now, the funeral looming, I see those moments as the fault lines deepening, splitting us into separate continents. Dustin's disdain, Brianna's ambition, they were pulling away, and I was too stubborn or too scared to bridge the gap. The cracks in our marriage didn't just widen, they shattered us, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to hold. By the time Dustin turned 15, our home on Hillcrest Avenue felt like a stage for Brianna's corporate drama, not a family sanctuary. Her business dinners multiplied, filled with sharp-suited executives who spoke in acronyms I couldn't parse, while I washed dishes in the background, invisible in my own house. Dustin's birthday that year was the breaking point, a memory that still burns. Brianna planned a lavish party, more networking event than celebration, with catered sushi and a string quartet in our backyard. I'd wanted something simpler: hot dogs, music from a portable speaker, his school friends running wild under the stars. "This is embarrassing," I told her the night before, watching servers arrange floral centerpieces that cost more than my monthly paycheck. "He's a kid, not a CEO." She turned, her eyes cold, calculating. "He's growing up in a different world, Jerry. These connections will shape his future." I pushed back, voice low. "What about being a kid?" Her silence was answer enough, and the party went on. Dustin charming adults with talk of tech startups, while I stood by the pool, feeling like an outsider at my son's milestone. That night marked the slide into our end, a slow-motion collapse I couldn't stop. Brianna's business consumed her. Weekend dinners became conference calls, vacations canceled for client emergencies. Dustin's baseball games competed with her board meetings, and the meetings always won. "You don't understand the pressure," she'd snap when I complained about her absence, her laptop glowing as she typed through another midnight. But I knew pressure. Keeping the power grid running, ensuring lights stayed on for thousands, a quiet service that didn't demand applause. The difference was, my work served others, hers served her ambition. Dustin, meanwhile, grew into her shadow, dismissing my suggestions of trade school or community college as beneath him. "That's the kind of thinking holding you back, Dad," he said at 17, his voice sharp with Brianna's cadence. "You settled for mediocrity. I won't." The words cut deep, not just for their cruelty but because they echoed her unspoken judgment, the weight of my inadequacy growing heavier each year. The final explosion came during Dustin's senior year. Brianna missed his graduation for a client crisis in Denver, leaving me to cheer alone in a sea of proud parents. Back home, in our sterile granite kitchen, I let years of frustration spill. "Enough, Brianna. Family has to come first sometimes." She stood in her business suit, checking emails at midnight, and looked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. "Don't lecture me on priorities. Everything we have, Dustin's future, this house, exists because of my work." I gestured at the empty kitchen. What about what we've lost? Like us? Her eyes held mine, and I saw the truth before she spoke. We weren't a family anymore, just a business arrangement past its expiration. Maybe it's time we stop pretending, she said quietly. The divorce took 6 months, her lawyers surgical in their efficiency. I got our old starter home on Maple Street, now a rental property, and enough money to live modestly. She kept everything else: house, company, and Dustin's loyalty. Afterward, Dustin's rejection was absolute. You're holding me back too, he told me during one of our last talks, packing for Denver to join Brianna's firm. Your guilt about simple living, it's toxic. I can't be around that. I sat in the Maple Street house, surrounded by boxes of memories. Photos from Yellowstone, Dustin's old drawings, Brianna's business card from that diner. They meant nothing to the people I'd loved most. The years that followed were quiet, my life shrinking to the rhythm of work, retirement, and small routines. I'd see Dustin's name in articles about Brianna's company, a rising star in her empire, while I fixed sprinklers and paid bills. The pain dulled but never left, a bruise I carried under my skin. Now, as I ironed my suit for the funeral, the silence of my apartment felt heavier, filled with echoes of that final fight. I'd spent 15 years believing I'd failed them, that my simplicity was a flaw. The will reading loomed, a formality I couldn't fathom. Maybe a small keepsake, a nod to our past. But why me? Outside, the Wyoming dusk painted the sky in bruised purples, mirroring the ache in my chest. I folded the suit, wondering what awaited at the chapel, where Dustin's anger and Brianna's ghost would collide. Part of me wanted to skip it, to avoid the judgment, but another part, the part that still loved her, despite everything, knew I had to go. I'd face whatever came, not for absolution, but to honor the woman who'd once promised me forever, even if forever had slipped through our fingers like sand. The morning of Brianna's funeral dawned gray and cold, the kind of Wyoming May that bites at your knuckles. I stood before my bathroom mirror, adjusting a tie I hadn't worn in years, its navy silk unfamiliar against my calloused fingers. The reflection showed a man older than I felt, silver hair where brown used to be, lines etched from years of quiet disappointments. The drive to Riverside Memorial Chapel took me through Rock Springs' economic patchwork. My modest apartment complex, middle-class subdivisions, then the manicured estates where Brianna's world thrived. The chapel perched on a hill, its Gothic spires looming like a judgment. I parked my battered Honda between a Lexus and a Tesla, feeling like a trespasser. The lot was packed, Mercedes sedans, BMW SUVs, cars that screamed wealth I'd never touched. Inside, the air smelled of lilies and polished wood, the pews filled with over 200 mourners, their hushed voices blending grief with networking buzz. I slipped into a back pew, hoping to vanish into the mahogany shadows, but whispers followed like a breeze rustling leaves. A woman in a sleek black suit nudged her companion, pointing my way. Her ex-husband. Can you believe he showed up? Fragments of gossip stung. Me, the villain who dragged Brianna down. I'd learned not to fight those stories, but they still burned. Dad. Dustin's voice sliced through the hum, sharp as a blade. I looked up to see him striding down the aisle, 37, radiating his mother's commanding presence in a suit that cost more than my rent. His eyes blazed with disbelief, barely masking fury. What are you doing here? I stood, meeting his gaze. I came to pay my respects. His cologne, sharp and expensive, hit me as he stepped closer. You lost that right 15 years ago. She wouldn't want you here. The chapel fell silent. 200 pairs of eyes locked on us like spectators at a prize fight. Maybe not, I said, voice steady despite the weight of their stares, but I needed to be here. Dustin's face tightened. For what? To play the grieving widower for people who know what kind of husband you were. The accusations landed like blows, but I'd felt this judgment before, in those final years when my simplicity became her shame. I'll sit in the back, Dustin. I won't cause trouble. His voice rose, drawing murmurs. You'll leave now. You embarrassed her enough when she was alive. Before I could reply, he turned to the crowd, his tone commanding, a prosecutor in a courtroom. I apologize for this disruption. My father seems to forget divorce means you're no longer family. Nods rippled through the pews, agreement whispered. This is Jerry Flores, he continued, gesturing at me like swatting a fly, the man who held back one of the most brilliant women this town ever knew. His words painted me as the anchor to her soaring ambition, a narrative I'd heard in fragments over the years. "Dustin, enough," I said, sharper than intended. He whirled back. "Is it? These people deserve to know why you're here, acting like you mattered to her." The crowd leaned in, hungry for drama. I stood my ground, feeling the old weight of inadequacy, but refusing to buckle. "I loved your mother for 40 years, I said, voice carrying through the silence. 22 as her husband, 18 more wishing her well despite everything. I'm here to honor that, not to claim anything." The silence stretched, taut as a wire. Dustin froze, unprepared for resistance. 5 minutes until the service, the funeral director announced, breaking the spell. Dustin shot me a final glare before stalking to the front pew reserved for family. Whispers resumed, nerve of some people, poor Dustin. But I stayed, sinking back into the pew. The eulogy painted Brianna as a visionary, her business triumphs overshadowing our shared past. Readings from colleagues lauded her innovation. Music swelled with themes of victory. I sat through it all, eyes on the stained glass windows, their colors blurring as memories of our early days fought to surface. When it ended, mourners filed past Dustin, offering condolences while ignoring me. I waited until the chapel nearly emptied, ready to slip out, when a man approached. Dan Morrison, lawyer, in a crisp suit with a leather briefcase. "Mr. Flores, a word about the will reading." His handshake was firm, his tone neutral but kind. "Brianna was specific about your presence." Dustin appeared, interest flickering through his grief. "Both of us?" he asked, skeptical. Dan nodded. "It's required." I felt a flicker of unease. Why me? But followed them out, the weight of the confrontation lingering like smoke, the will reading a looming unknown. The walk to Dan Morrison's office felt like a march to judgment, 3 blocks through downtown Rock Springs under a sky heavy with clouds. My shoes scuffed the sidewalk, each step echoing the chapel's confrontation, while Dustin strode ahead, his tailored coat flapping like a warning flag. Dan kept up neutral chatter, weather, the service's turnout, his voice a careful buffer between us. The office, on the top floor of a restored Victorian, smelled of leather and old books, its walls lined with diplomas and photos of Dan with local bigwigs. It was Brianna's kind of place, prestigious, rooted in tradition. "Please sit," Dan said, gesturing to 2 leather chairs before his mahogany desk. Dustin claimed the one closest to him, leaving me the side seat, a fitting symbol of my outsider status. The room's silence pressed in, broken only by the tick of an antique clock as Dan opened a thick file, pulling out legal documents with practiced care. Afternoon light slanted through tall windows, catching dust motes that danced ghosts of promises past. "Before we begin," Dan said, adjusting his glasses, "my condolences again. Brianna was a valued client and a friend." Dustin nodded solemnly. I stayed quiet, unsure what role I played here. Dan lifted the will, its pages crisp with blue backing. "This is the last will and testament of Brianna Elizabeth Flores, executed March 15, 2024, witnessed per Wyoming law." 14 months ago, why had she rewritten it? Had she sensed her end? "The will confirms she was of sound mind, under no coercion," Dan continued, his voice formal, deliberate. Dustin leaned forward, hands clasped, anticipation in his posture like a man ready to claim his throne. I sat back, expecting some minor formality, a keepsake perhaps, or confirmation I had no claim. Dan turned the page, his glasses glinting. "To my son, Dustin Michael Flores, I leave the family home at 847 Hillcrest Avenue, with all furnishings and personal property." Dustin's smile spread, satisfied. That house was worth $800,000, a mansion of mountain views and polished floors. Additionally, I bequeath $500,000, transferred within 60 days of probate. Dustin's smile flickered, just slightly, as if he'd expected more. $500,000 was life-changing, but Brianna's empire was worth millions more. Where was the company? I watched him calculate, his fingers tightening. "That's wonderful," he said, voice betraying a hint of unease. "But what about Mom's business?" Dan's expression stayed neutral. "I'm continuing with the bequests, Dustin." He turned the page, and the air shifted, heavy with something unspoken. "The bequest to Dustin includes conditions," Dan read. "The inheritance is contingent on his continued employment with Flores Consulting Solutions for 2 years post-execution, or until the company is sold or dissolved." Dustin's confidence cracked. "Conditions? Sold?" His voice sharpened. Mom would never sell her life's work. Dan cleaned his glasses, a deliberate pause. These are her words, Dustin. I shifted, feeling like an intruder in this family drama. $500,000 and a mansion were more than I'd ever dreamed. Yet Dustin's unease mirrored my own growing dread. What was coming? Dan lifted the next page, his tone steady but weighted. The will contains provisions for the remaining assets, constituting the majority of the estate. He looked at me, his eyes carrying a mix of sympathy and obligation. To my former husband, Jerry Michael Flores, I bequeath $33.5 million from my primary investment accounts and securities portfolio. The words detonated in the quiet room. My mouth fell open, breath caught in my chest. 33.5 million, numbers so vast they belonged to someone else's life, not mine, a man scrubbing coffee stains and dodging neighbor complaints. There's a mistake, I stammered, voice distant. Did you say 33 million? 33.5 million, Dan corrected, calm but watchful. Dustin's face drained white, then flushed red, rage igniting. What? He choked. Dan pressed on, relentless. Additionally, I transferred to Jerry Flores controlling interest in Flores Consulting Solutions, including all subsidiaries, real estate, and assets, with 65% ownership and appointment as chairman of the board. The room tilted, my heart pounding like it might break free. Controlling interest in Brianna's empire, the company that had swallowed our marriage, that had made me feel small, was mine. This can't be right, I whispered. There's an error. Dan removed his glasses, cleaning them again. No error, Mr. Flores. Brianna reviewed every word, adamant about her wishes. Dustin shot to his feet, chair slamming against the wall. This is impossible. What did you do? His finger jabbed at me, trembling with fury. How'd you manipulate her? I didn't, I said weakly, still reeling. I haven't spoken to her in 15 years. Liar, he shouted, voice cracking. Nobody gives $33 million to their ex for nothing. Dan's tone cut through, firm. Brianna was of sound mind, with a competency evaluation to prevent challenges. I sat frozen. The numbers, $33.5 million, 65% of a multi-million-dollar company, swirling like a fever dream. Why would she do this? Dustin's rage filled the room, but beneath it, I sensed his world crumbling, and mine was about to change in ways I couldn't grasp. Dustin's rage hung in the air like storm clouds, thick and electric, as he paced the office, his face twisted in betrayal. This is fraud, he screamed, slamming a fist on Dan's desk, papers fluttering like startled birds. She was manipulated, coerced, something's wrong. He whirled toward me, eyes wild. You did this. There's no other way. I shrank back, the accusations hitting like stones, overwhelmed by the fury I'd never seen so raw in him. Dustin, I swear I had no idea, I said, voice hoarse. I didn't even know she was gone until that call. Liar. His palm struck the desk again, echoing, Nobody hands over an empire to the man who abandoned her. Dan raised a hand, his professional calm straining. Gentlemen, control yourselves. These are Brianna's clear wishes, backed by evaluations. Dustin spun on him. I want every document scrutinized, psych evals, contacts from the last 5 years. Dan shook his head. There were no contacts, Dustin. She made that plain. The room pulsed with his son's pain, a mix of grief and shattered expectations that made my chest ache despite the venom. Dan reached for a manila envelope, Brianna's handwriting scrawled across it, elegant loops I'd recognize anywhere. Brianna anticipated this difficulty, he said gently. She left a personal message to explain, to be read after the provisions. Dustin stopped pacing, his breath ragged, curiosity warring with fury. A message? She couldn't tell me to my face, but she wrote to him. It addresses both of you, Dan replied, opening the envelope and extracting cream stationery. I nodded faintly, desperate for any light in this chaos. Let's hear it. Dustin slumped into his chair, hatred flashing in his eyes, but beneath it, a hunger for understanding. Dan cleared his throat, beginning in Brianna's words, her voice somehow alive through his reading. My dearest Jerry, if you're hearing this, I'm gone, and you're probably wondering if the world's gone mad. I can picture your face, that polite confusion, like when I'd rearranged the furniture without warning. A faint smile tugged at my lips. She'd nailed it, and hearing her essence made the room feel warmer, less hostile. I know this shocks you, that you're thinking you don't deserve it, but you're wrong. You deserve every penny, and I'll tell you why. Dan paused, glancing at us. I never stopped loving you, Not in our fights, not the divorce, not these 15 years of silence. I was angry at you for not grasping my ambitions, but angrier at myself for choosing them over us. You tried to save our marriage, begging for balance. I was too proud to listen. Tears pricked my eyes, hot and sudden, as decades of regret washed over me. This was absolution I never sought. From the woman who'd shaped my joys and sorrows. Dustin, my brilliant boy, the letter continued, and he stiffened, face paling. I know you're furious, convinced your father manipulated me. But you're not ready for this yet. You've lived in my success's shadow, taking benefits without the weight of building from scratch, without hard choices. Dustin whispered, "That's not true," but his voice cracked, conviction waning. You've spent years hating a good man for crimes he didn't commit. Jerry taught me character, integrity, the strength that doesn't crush others. I forgot those when I picked business over love, but never the man who showed them. I wept openly now, not caring, as her words rebuilt my shattered self-worth. Dustin made a wounded sound, rage giving way to raw pain. Jerry, this is more than money. It's a chance to use wealth for good as I should have. I trust you because you never craved it, because you'll wield it with kindness. Dustin, your inheritance gives you comfort to discover yourself without unlimited power's burden. Build something. Value people over profit. Forgive your father for being human. The letter went on, practical notes on arrangements, hopes for our futures, but the heart was clear. Love over entitlement, wisdom over wealth. When Dan finished, silence blanketed us, profound and heavy. I clutched the envelope he handed me, trembling, holding Brianna's final words like a lifeline. Dustin stared at the floor, his empire dreams crumbling. This isn't over, he muttered, voice hollow. I can contest incapacity, influence. I looked at him, seeing not the angry man but the boy I'd lost, shaped by pressures he'd never questioned. You could try, I said softly, but she was right. You're not ready. He laughed bitterly. And you are? A nobody with no experience? Brianna's echo strengthened me. Maybe not in business, but in knowing service over self. He gathered his coat, smaller now. This is insane, Dan interjected. She was healthy, evaluations solid. Dustin's voice broke. Why me? I was everything she wanted. Compassion surged. She did it for you, to free you from shadows. He left without reply, door clicking shut like a chapter's end. Dan rustled papers. Paperwork ahead, transitions, but the team's strong. I nodded, dazed. Did she really love me after everything? He smiled genuinely. She spoke of you often. The man who taught success without character is failure. Walking out, the sun felt warmer, air fresher. I had responsibilities now, a company to guide with integrity. Brianna trusted in me. Justice wasn't revenge, it was recognition. That character endures, love persists. As the days unfolded after that pivotal afternoon in Dan's office, the whirlwind of changes settled into a gentler rhythm, like a river calming after a storm. I moved through the initial haze of paperwork and board meetings with a quiet determination, learning the intricacies of Brianna's empire, not as a conqueror, but as a steward committed to her vision of responsible growth. The company's team, a group of dedicated professionals she'd nurtured, welcomed me with cautious respect, sharing insights that bridged my gaps in expertise. Gradually, I implemented small shifts, programs for employee well-being, community investments in Rock Springs, ways to use the wealth as a tool for uplift rather than mere accumulation. Dustin's threats of contesting the will faded into silence. Whispers reached me that he'd taken time away, perhaps reflecting on his mother's words, starting a modest venture of his own, far from the shadows of expectation. In quieter moments, alone in the Maple Street house now feeling less empty, I'd reread Brianna's letter, her handwriting a soft bridge to the past. It brought not just closure, but a blooming sense of peace, affirming that our love, though fractured, had endured in ways neither of us fully grasped while she lived. I found myself walking the old trails we once hiked, the wind carrying echoes of laughter from those early years. And in that solitude, forgiveness bloomed, for her choices, for Dustin's pain, for my own perceived shortcomings. Life's tapestry, woven with threads of regret and redemption, revealed its beauty in hindsight, teaching that true inheritance lies not in fortunes, but in the character we cultivate and the connections we mend. As evenings lengthened into soft twilights, I'd sit on the porch, watching stars emerge like gentle promises, whispering thanks to Brianna for this unexpected grace, a chance to honor her legacy with the humility she valued most.